Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Your ERP system got you here, now what? I am Brian Zimmerman with Becker's Hospital Review. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We're looking forward to hearing your questions. We will also have a series of audience polling questions during today's webinar. When we reach each poll slide, the poll question will pop up automatically on your screen. Our speakers will give a few seconds for you to select an answer from the options on your screen and click Submit. Thank you in advance for your participation. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Chuck Winnie, Senior Director of Healthcare Strategy at Infor. He has 3.5 years healthcare experience, 11 years in management consulting experience, 75% of which occurred in the healthcare space. Todd Stonestrom, Director of Healthcare Technology Strategy at Infor. He has 25 years in explicit healthcare focus, both EHR and ERP experience. And at this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Chuck to begin today's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So today, wanted to get together and talk about one main topic, again, that concept of what is your ERP really getting you today, and really trying to help everyone to challenge how to think about that. So two main goals of today. As I said, first off, consider what your ERP, so for those who aren't aware, that's the combination of your accounting, supply, and HR system, to consider what your ERP would require to become, quote unquote, strategically aligned with your mission as a healthcare provider. And the second thing is to really just generally think differently about your next non-clinical software purchase in light of number one. So the concept of, okay, we're looking at a new piece of software that does X. Well, is that really strategic? And how does that interact with the ERP? And how does that interact with the EHR? So the main goals. The one commonality that I wanted to focus on around, and I think you kind of saw it in the goals there with the focus on the strategically aligned with your mission concept, is what our common mission is, everybody on this phone. In the last couple of years, I've easily read well over 100 different healthcare provider mission statements. I always like to read them before I go into clients just to make sure that I'm speaking the same language as them and whatnot. And the one thing that I always note that I particularly like, and this only happens sometimes, is the ones who specifically say the word patient happiness or allude to the concept in general. Because that word happiness is so important. It's their health, their experience as they're in the health system, and what is the financial burden of coming through the health system. So if we're making the patient well, but they're coming out of the door effectively poor because they have so many bills, did we really, quote unquote, do no harm or injustice, as the Hippocratic Oath has us looking to do? And the way I look at it is, by working in healthcare at all, we all really need to take that same point of view. So that's really, again, the key to the conversation today. How do we foster that connection between the care teams and their patients? How do we collectively drive down costs such that eventually patient premiums and payments can be reduced? How do we drive a culture of continuous improvement within our health provider system that continues to specifically benefit our patients and keeps us nimble enough to shield our caregivers from worrying about changing regulations, changing business models like value-based care and things of that nature? One great example, as I was talking with a CFO last week who mentioned one thing he's really interested in is reducing back-end administration costs. And at first that seems really greedy. Is he just margin hunting, or what's he looking to do? And he wasn't at all. He wants to take every dollar that he can save on the back end and reinvest it specifically in their insurance plan. This health system actually has a joined up insurance plan, so that those patient premiums can go down. That's part of the mission that they are looking to do. And I think it's just a perfect example of how are we really trying to help with that. And when you look at ERP, a lot of times it's just a bean counting software that isn't really accomplishing that. So with that being said, I'm going to take us into our first poll question that we can look at for how we specifically drive change. So this first poll question, if everybody can can go into the screen and make a selection. The question is, do you view your current ERP, so the one that you're using today, as a strategic resource that is actually aligned with your organization's mission? Or is it a basic commodity that requires third-party add-ons to provide that strategic alignment that you're looking for? So effectively asking, is it strategic? Is it directly helping patients? Or, at the end of the day, is your general ledger something that could really be ripped and replaced, and it's other third-party tools around it? And same concept with your supply chain. Could that effectively be ripped and replaced? Is it the third-party tools that surround it that are helping you run the business? Okay, we've given it a few seconds, so we'll jump ahead, and everybody should be able to see the results. And as we kind of expected, largely most people view it as the commodity. It is that non-strategic resource. And those that did do the strategic resource, obviously you've got my name and my information. I would totally love to interact with you. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or any other way. I'd just be curious what it is that you feel makes it strategic. I'd love to learn from you and vice versa as to what it is that gives that perception within your organization. Because almost every client that I talk to, it is that commodity. So always wondering to hear what the value and the benefits are. So I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about how ERP got here today, and from there talk about how that relates to healthcare in particular. So ERP, again, that accounting, HR, and supply chain systems. For those who aren't aware, it effectively started in the 70s as a supply chain tool. It then obviously evolved from there. So it didn't do much until the 90s. That's when everybody began embedding accounting and HR functionality into it. So if you think about it, what most people look at as ERP, and even as I described it earlier, it effectively hasn't changed in 20 plus years. The largest audience was clearly manufacturing before. While they have CRM and order processing systems and other things, they don't have to worry about the complexity of an EHR and the complexity of other things. And I don't really feel like it's evolved that much since then. We had the Y2K, so major adoption of ERP at that time, sunsetting all the legacy green screen systems, the AS400s and whatnot, which was the biggest boom in adoption in healthcare. But at that point, it was really kind of the vendors trying to look how to save money from that point. So in the 2000s, it was a what I would call an industry agnostic consolidation. It was the specialized vendors who focused on individual industries were combining everything together. They were putting lipstick on the pig, so to speak, to make sure that the industries felt like they were being facilitated. But at the end of the day, it was all the same software. In the 2010s, then, it changed a little bit to let's replatform everything so that we can adopt a software as a service model, which most of the software vendors were really doing to increase their value multiples on Wall Street. So wasn't a ton really in the 2000s and the 2010s, not a ton of innovation occurring from a healthcare specific point of view in this space. And that's really what I'm here to challenge then is how do we get over that? If I look at a diagram, so a general high level of what is our current day healthcare software footprint and how does it work, you've got a handful of pieces to the puzzle. So you've got the ERP in the upper right. You also have workforce management. So that's how I call time and attendance, scheduling, things of that nature. Largely disconnected, though. You're certainly going to have integrations from here to there, but largely disconnected. In the bottom left, then, you've got the behemoth of the EHR, clearly not to scale this drawing. However, clearly that behemoth that also needs to be or should be connected with everything, primarily in this graphic via that third-party costing tool. Not really many of the vendors who do the ERP side of the house have embedded costing, let alone they may have some integrations to the costing. And then the same concept goes along with the third-party analytics. I will say that is one place that the vendors have increased functionality and capabilities with regard to what we can do. But at the end of the day, it's all disjointed. It all kind of is separated from that patient who is at the center of everything. So that quadruple aim concept of the image that we saw earlier. So what I'll say is, why doesn't this work for healthcare in particular? And I'd say there's a handful of reasons. The first one being, according to Fitch, 54.9% of labor or of your hospital expenses in 2018 came out of labor. It's kind of crazy to me that when almost 55% of our expenses are coming out of a single place, that is effectively a wholly separate tool that we're using to do those analyses and to actually collect the information. Now when you're doing things like labor productivity analysis and things like that, that's all still separate. So you have these additional data integrations that are burdening you, so you can't do it that often, all those productivity analytics, and it gets tough. It's just crazy to me that one is separate. Next one is, this is a statistic from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They say we'll need 439,300 new nurses by 2024. That clearly is only going to raise the labor cost even higher. That percentage is clearly going to have to go up. And frankly, I think part of it is it's not surprising how high things like nursing turnover is when we hear all these complaints about things like inequitable distribution of workloads of patients. When we hear things about people being frustrated by doing basic tasks like scheduling or accepting shifts or just even trying to find out what their last paycheck was and how it was chopped up. You know, the expectations of our caregivers are that they can interact with data via their phones, via mobile devices, and a lot of the systems that people have in place today don't necessarily facilitate that. And what I would argue is they need to facilitate much more than that, because that's already the expectation that we're past. This also relates to physician and general clinician burnout, another top-of-mind concept of many organizations that I talk to, especially those in those hyper-competitive inner-city markets like Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, et cetera. It's just we need more clinicians, and the way I look at it is, do we necessarily need that many if we can find ways to improve the efficiencies of the ones that we have and to make them happier? Third item that I will bring up is the introduction of the value-based revenue models. Obviously been here for a few years, but it's really, really picking up steam. And it fundamentally requires us to have a better, more timely understanding of what our baseline costs are and how that impacts quality of care and things of that nature. I also always challenge people when I'm talking about this concept that people enter into these value-based care contracts and they largely are just saying, okay, I'll give you X dollars for this type of procedure over this period of time. And what I'm always surprised at is the lack of data exchange that the provider side of the house requires as part of that. The ability to say, okay, we have a patient that we're getting paid based on results of. Shouldn't we also demand information about if they were submitting claims where they received care outside of my system while they were on vacation? That even if it isn't related, who knows how far away a comorbidity really has to be not related. There are certainly things that can be correlated, let alone things like prescription refills and things like that to know whether or not they're actually following through with the care that we're providing. So a lot of pieces to that value-based revenue model that really just aren't being facilitated in this current topology. This also goes hand in hand with the concept of changing delivery models. Again, for the past handful of years, we've already found ourselves down this path of moving from inpatient to outpatient. But concepts like when I do a procedure, where do I do it? That requires specific supplies, and should I necessarily do it everywhere? We've got health systems. Doesn't necessarily make sense to offer the same specific service at 3 different locations that are all within 5 miles of each other. Or should we have a specific location specialize in that service? The current ERP footprint and how it interacts with the EHR, you really have to pull a lot of data from a lot of different places to be able to start to look at and answer those types of strategic questions. The next one I say is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke. In my 11 years of management consulting before I took my current role, I did budgeting and planning. As Brian had said, 75% of that was in healthcare organizations. The majority of that was in physicians groups in academic medical centers. And again, specifically, since they were in academic medical centers, the surprising part to me was how disconnected these planning processes were. especially when I got in there, but even that the technology only allowed us to do so much at a given time. Most clients that I still talk to today, they do a massive annual budget that isn't necessarily as driver-based as it could be, let alone are we correlating the drivers that matter. So, you know, you end up with these budget holders that are guessing dollar amounts because it was the same amount they used last year. It's so hard to turn around that initial annual budget. They do it so far in advance because it's hard to get the data together that very often by the time the year starts, that year they were budgeting for, the numbers are already 3 months old by the time anybody massaged them or looked at them. And then if you're lucky, some organizations do quarterly and more rarely they do monthly high-level reforecast, but it's usually at a super high level. There's not necessarily much budget holder buy-in. So if you're one of the organizations on the call who happens to do those monthly reforecasts, that's awesome. I applaud you because that's not where most of the organizations that I talk to are at. The biggest problem with that, and another reason I call it guest-based, is even within these budget models, they're rather disconnected. So while you may be doing some level of driver-based planning, you may be using separate drivers. So in the example I used before where I said I was coming out of a lot of physicians groups in academic medical centers, the physician groups are using CPT codes to drive everything, while the hospital side of the academic medical center is using DRG incident volumes to drive everything. Yet nobody took the time to sit back and do a correlation of, okay, if we have this many DRG incidents, then what is their associated CPT codes that they should be driving? So there was no real true up between those drivers. So again, if you have all the data separate, it's really hard to do that. If we can start to get it together, then that begins to be feasible. The next one I'll advance to then is, you know, all those things that I just mentioned, especially in the planning area, it almost really doesn't matter if we don't have the ability to do any type of reactive decision making because our data is so disparate. You know, some concepts we can't do much about. I understand payroll is only run once every 2 weeks, but does that mean you shouldn't be looking at pulling data out of your time and attendance system maybe to do better, more timely productivity reporting? Even then, you know, even if you accomplish that and figure out ways around that, do you really have to wait for the month-end accruals to come in to do your variance reporting? I would argue no, not if your system can handle doing, let's say, separate ledgers than your general ledger. Can you pull in, do forecasted accruals to start to do mid-month analytics well before the month is closed? I just talked to so many clients who they still wait until 10 days after the close to build their first variance report. At that point, you're now 40 days after the actual month started. That's way too late to make any kind of decision. So again, more things that I just generally challenge. I think the main point of this overall slide really is that I think everybody would be hard-pressed to say that this model meets our current needs. There's lots of issues with it, and that's where I would really propose changing the nature of looking at it. So fundamentally saying, as I'm looking at new software vendors, no matter who they are, no matter what they offer, shouldn't the data be normalized? And the best way to normalize that data so I can get value out of it, so I can actually look at the data, do analytics on it, and so I can use it for decision making, shouldn't that be all part of a core healthcare operations platform? So I actually challenge whether or not an ERP is what a healthcare organization needs. Again, we've got all this different way of looking at data. We need to pull it together. I would argue that the healthcare operations platform is the concept that any healthcare organization should actually look for to get the benefits that they need to run their business more efficiently. So in my opinion, a healthcare operations platform, that's number one. That's the most important thing because you need that foundation with which now you can make better decisions. Number two, I would say, and I would challenge everybody on the phone to think about is how are you clinically connected? And this does not mean just how do I do data integrations and how do I do interoperability. That's the baseline requirement, but it's what do you do with the data once you've integrated the data and once you've done interoperability and put the data in all the different places where it could be useful. So let's look at some examples of what I mean by that. So first off, we've got a patient, they're sitting there, they're in pain and they're scared. You know, that's anybody who's been through an experience such as this, you certainly know how everyone feels. The second person I'll call out is their loved one. So they're worried about their loved one and how this is going to impact their family. Many times the first thing that they're thinking about is actually, oh man, I'm on a high deductible health plan. What's this going to do to us? concepts like that we need to fundamentally take into account as we're looking at the patient experience, because their loved one is such an important part of that. Half the time, I know when my wife was in the ICU for some time, she doesn't even really remember any of it. So it was really me that was dealing with all these concepts. So it's an interesting concept of who is really having the experience. What I would say then is we've got the doctor. They're thinking about what the right care is for this patient. They're undoubtedly a little bit distracted. But the first thing I would say is, are we properly facilitating their decision making to know things like, should I order this test versus that test? Is there a cost difference between these two very like solutions? And I know anybody who has experience with cost accounting who's on this right now will say, yeah, certainly we do everything we can to bridge that. And I certainly applaud that. And anybody who gets to the level of detail where you're talking with the clinicians, that's certainly what has to be done. But I talk to so many organizations who generate cost data, and it effectively never goes anywhere, whether it's because the physicians never felt connected to the building of that cost allocation model or whatever it may be. They very oftentimes are effectively disconnected from it. I know certain organizations, EHRs like Epic, I believe, they're actually putting a field now directly into the EHR that has, as a clinician or as a physician is trying to figure out what procedures to do, it'll actually give estimated costs. Now, to my knowledge, Epic isn't generating that data. They're just popping the field in there. And so it really opens it up for everyone else to work together to figure out what's the best way of populating that field such that that physician can make the best decisions. The part where it really opens up is when we look at the nurse, in my opinion. So the nurses can ask a handful of questions at a given time. They're always very distracted because it's a frantic day when they're on the floor. First off, they may be thinking, are my patients more demanding than my peers? I saw Nurse Jackie standing over there twiddling her thumbs. Of course, she wasn't twiddling her thumbs, but that's the perception that this individual nurse may have. And they just can't help but think that, man, I just feel like I'm doing more work than everybody else. So, are we really doing everything we can to make sure that everyone's schedules are equal or as equal as possible based on something, whether it be patient acuity or other similar concepts? How do we balance that all out? Next off, who can I trade weekend shifts with? Obviously, everybody has home lives, so they need to think about, wow, I can make some extra money this weekend. I may want to pick up a shift. I may want to do something else. Is there an easy way for them to do that, or is it very complicated and convoluted, let alone for the nurse manager? Is it very hard for he or she to actually do the scheduling for the weekend? I'll never forget my twins were in the NICU for a little over 2 weeks, and I was in there one night. It was a Friday night, and I was talking with the one nurse, and I heard this woohoo out of the corner. And with that, the nurse manager walked out. She was like, I did it. It took me 4 hours, but I scheduled the weekend. And I'll never forget that because it was just so crazy to me that it can take 4 hours to schedule the NICU for a weekend when, these are things that if you're connecting the right bits of data together, it should be relatively straightforward to just have the computer do it for you. The last one here on the nurse is I wonder if I would like working in the ED. And this was a particularly interesting one to me. Nursing turnover, what it is, especially first-year nursing turnover, which the numbers that I've seen can be significantly higher, up to 3 times higher than normal nursing turnover. It was interesting to me. I used to work with a nurse. She was our strategy director for analytics, and she actually used to be in, I believe it was the Army. She was in the Armed Forces as a nurse, and she came out. She went over to a normal hospital in the provider setting. And what was interesting is obviously she was no longer a nurse when I knew her. She obviously fell out from nursing. And when she sat down and she thought about it, well, she took this test. There are kind of like eHarmony type tests that say whether or not you're a match for your job, let alone your specific role. And what was funny is it told her she is very much better off when her patients are unconscious. Which it's a funny thing to say, but it actually makes sense. There's lots of nurses, and depending on their personalities, that's how they may be. And it was just interesting to me that right now, because we're not connecting the data, we're not looking at everything, we're not figuring out, okay, what are the right types of patients potentially for your personality type? And are we really shooting ourselves in the foot as an industry by not acknowledging those types of concepts? If I advance a little bit, let's look at supplies. Let's look at, is there preventive maintenance due on this machine? Is there a stain on the floor? I always hear a lot of stories from nurses as well of supply issues where it's like, oh yeah, we used to run out of this one type of irrigation syringe, so we had to hide it in the ceiling tiles in the one office room. And if you can have things like AI-based algorithms that are going to sit there and actually run the numbers to figure out how do we prevent stockouts, but still make sure there are enough there, while at the same time making sure nothing's on recall. And if it is on recall, auto-substituting in that case, there should be ways that we can leverage, again, leveraging the data, leveraging that non-guest-based, driver-based modeling for our annual budget, let alone our monthly reforecasts. Shouldn't we be able to connect all this together to make sure that those irrigation syringes are always there so nobody has to worry about them? Similar concepts for things like preventive maintenance. I had heard a story once where they were monitoring the voltage peaks on an MRI machine, and they realized that the voltage peaks happened in such a way that it meant that I think it was one of the motors in the MRI machine was starting to go, and if they then replaced it in the next X hours, it decreased the likelihood of the MRI machine stopping working by some specific percent. So you can start to see there's really, numerical quantitative value by tying this data together. And now you don't have patients who are annoyed because they can't get the MRI and they're stuck waiting for an hour and a half or whatever it may be. As I advance again, it's also just generally where does the data from these devices go? Where is the missing device? So I read a stat once that said nurses spend about 20% of any given shift looking for stuff. So whether it may be those irrigation syringes, maybe it be an ultrasound IV machine, or maybe an infusion pump, or whatever it may be, just being able to find the stuff. We already talked about making sure the preventive maintenance was done on it. It's just another thing that we should really learn to expect. Whether we are using RTLS, so that's real-time location services, and actually tracking in three-dimensional wireframes where each device is in the hospital, or even if we're just using RFID and looking through gateways as it moves in and out of doors, it's a concept that most organizations that I've talked with certainly could take a lot of advantage out of. I particularly call out the RTLS, that real-time location, because there's so much more that you can do with it, not just from a device point of view, but from your clinical staff point of view as well. I use that example of my wife being in the ICU and me being the one who was kind of with it, but obviously I went home every night to sleep and watch my older son, and then I'd come home once the care came, and I'd be standing there talking to her, and she'd be dozing off 30 seconds into every conversation, and she wasn't really sure what had happened that day. And I was thinking about, wouldn't it be great to have like a computer screen in the corner that would have told me, okay, nurse X was in here from this time to that time, nurse Y was in here from this time to another time, Dr. X was in here from these times. And then now when the nurse comes in, I'm a little bit more educated as to say, wow, this was great. My wife had people really checking in on her well. I know exactly who to ask my questions of. Hey, is Dr. X around? I'd love to ask him what he saw in the latest test, things like that. It also allows us to do other cool things from a costing point of view, because now if we have all that data that says these nurses were in and out at these times, now if you think about it, you can start to do more time-driven, activity-based costing at a much more detailed level than doing the mass allocations that we're doing today. So again, it's really about how do we have the functionality. I always reinforce clinically connected is not about having data interoperability. It's about saying, how can I take the data that we have, normalize it and get it together such that I can now add value-added functionality for my clinicians to better connect with their patients. I mentioned before about the eHarmony type concept for nurses to make sure they're in the right roles. We have other AI type functionality as well for things like the supply stock being efficient, using things like machine learning algorithms to see if is this an anomaly that we have this kind of a patient load, or is it not? Doing things like checking and seeing those preventive maintenance concepts of, is this one voltage spike an anomaly or not? Is this something we should look at? And a lot of these now, what I would challenge everyone to do is think about AI and how, not just from a clinical setting, as this screen shows, but also from a deeper administrative setting, figuring out, are there ways that we can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to do things like that CFO I talked about earlier, and figure out, are there ways we can reduce administrative costs? Can we look for journal entries, and when they hit as outliers, can we flag them so that we now know to look at them where we may find there's maybe fraud, there may be any number of things. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Todd Stronstrom, who's going to talk a little bit more about artificial intelligence and how you can enable that within your organizations.
Thanks, Chuck. First, we're going to walk through our next series of poll questions. Those of you will give you about 30 seconds to a minute to answer these. But the first one title is, are you in your professional role already benefiting from an artificial intelligence within your organization? Many organizations have evolved further than others. So I'll give you a minute here to walk through, yes, I directly benefit. No, but we have plans to implement within 18 months. No, but we have plans to implement at least 18 months from now. While being discussed, we have no formal implementation timeline, or we are having trouble finding value in the potential use of AI and currently have no plan. So take a little time to respond to that, and we'll show the poll results, and we'll move into the final section of the webinar for today. So it looks like a few people have responded about what I've expected. Most organizations are still in the process, the early stages, but we certainly have some different case studies I want to walk through, as well as what we're seeing in the industry related to AI, as well as kind of just the overall trend that I kind of want to walk through over the course of the next 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. My background, I've been in healthcare for roughly 25 years. Over those 25 years, probably half of that's been involved with moving customers and transforming them from, 10 years ago when the conversation was purely virtualizing on-premise to reduce cost, to moving to a hosted or some sort of managed type of solution to reduce cost, to a full-out cloud-type based solution to reduce cost. And typically what we see in that is there's a 10 to 20% decrease in cost just by leveraging virtualization and or getting that hardware out of your system, not dealing with the third parties to maintain it. Things like VMware, components like that internally, and having staff that have to keep up on maintaining those things. The movement we're seeing now is really a movement to teaming up and partnering with software providers as well as infrastructure providers that have microservices built in to their solutions. In the past, from a development perspective, everything was very monolithic, meaning very coupled, run as a single service. Huge disadvantage of that is many dependencies from a code perspective, which slows down the capability to provide new features, functionalities, and solutions to you. If one thing breaks, everything's impacted. The movement now is really embedding microservices into your solution, so they're very lightweight, has pre-built independent APIs or web services components, which allows you to accomplish some of the things Chuck was talking about, to be able to get a complete view from the EMR all the way back into your clinically connected healthcare system to allow to make better outcomes and judgments. So by embedding microservices, things are much quicker, much more scalable. It provides a lot more agility, easily deployed, technical freedom, things of that nature. Infor uses several of these microservices within our solution. We have roughly over 70 plus microservices that we leverage through Amazon Web Services. Some common ones might be elastic containers. We're also working on some projects around serverless compute, which allows you to just use what is needed at the time versus having a giant stack of servers sitting there that may not be utilized more than 10% at any given time. So going serverless is kind of the next phase we see as well. The cloud market today has really changed from where it used to be. We see, over $40 billion invested from 3 primary vendors out there that probably are really going to support the majority of our health systems in the future. Obviously, there's other industries as well that are leveraging this. What I've seen is a huge transition in the IT budget over the course of the last 5 years, where 30% of the budget is probably allocated to a cloud spend, and that could be as simple as a DR approach off-site, or it could be a data warehouse, data lake strategy, or it could be what some organizations are doing is, full-fledged AI, machine learning, incorporating science, and really embracing some of those microservices that are out there in the industry. Some of the top 5 reasons we've seen cloud adoption, and most of this would be, probably pretty generic for what you guys have seen, and you probably understand that the ability to have a secure, compliant solution, work teaming up with, data center providers like an Amazon or a Microsoft, and a software provider that has an entire CISO group and a security office, makes sense than trying to repeat that for every organization with all the vulnerabilities and risks that are out there. Performance and scale, extremely important when you're getting into the areas that Chuck was talking about related to incorporating AI, some of the components in the exam room that need to be, real time, or being able to track assets much more efficiently to reduce, the overhead that occurs around some of the burdens that nurses have come across over the course of their shifts, as well as a total cost ownership. And I think a lot of the savings, once you're in the cloud, you've got to look at other ways other than, the raw power and storage being cheaper and things of that nature, because I think that's been pretty exhausted over the last 5 years. And I think moving into more of an innovation model, which is really the highlight on number 1, which I think touches base on a lot of those missions that Chuck talked about, as well as I've seen, is, the repeating theme that I've seen in most health systems is they need to improve patient care, improve patient experience. It is a very competitive market. Improve the employee and physician experience as well. Chuck had a stat where roughly 500,000 nurses will be, nursing jobs will be needed in the next short-term frame here. So how are you going to keep those nurses or attract them to your organization? And innovation and that first experience is extremely important. And then he mentioned also things around RTLS and things of that. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is provide more improved patient experience and reduce costs. And reducing costs really has to be outside of the box from what we traditionally looked at as just cutting items on a P&L or reducing hardware or consolidating hardware, because I think most of us have done all that. I recently attended reInvent, which is Amazon's large user conference. Roughly 60,000 people attend that conference annually. And I think to touch base on what some of the organizations out there are doing related to the next phase of reducing costs and improving the experience and reducing the burdens out there for a lot of employees around documentation. There was a great case study that was done by the CEO of Cerner, Brent Schaefer. He kind of talked about three key areas that they were focusing on: decreasing financial waste, lowering patient readmissions, reducing the documentation burden. So around the decreasing financial waste side of the thing, roughly a quarter of all U.S. healthcare spend, that's roughly $1 trillion, is wasted on unnecessary follow-ups, over-treating patients, gaps in digital information. This was the first area that they were going to tackle, leveraging, AI, as well as the visibility not only in the EMR but all the way back through the supply chain, in a truly connected solution that has a 360 of what your information looks like. They analyzed all that information. Their plan was to use a big data predictive analytics strategy to make more predictable, informed decisions. So they were leveraging, Amazon's analytics as well as data lakes technology to analyze large amounts of data to come up with, a much more prescriptive way to deliver care in the future. From a readmission perspective, this was really surprising to me that, roughly, on a readmission perspective, the AI and the microservices that they were embedding into their health systems, they were using to help predict when patients are at risk of being readmitted from a rehab facility, for example, back to the hospital. Obviously readmissions can be very expensive, oftentimes reimbursement problems when you talk about readmissions. So Cerner created a model to reduce those readmissions to the lowest in over a decade by using, technology around AI and machine learning to help try to identify early on which types of patients potentially could be subject to a readmission from, a rehab center, things of that nature. So that's another tool set that's being leveraged as a microservice to help, once you're in the cloud, reduce that technology burden that's out there. The final piece is, and Chuck talked a little bit about this earlier on, about the nurse issue around, 20% of their shift being repetitive and really around, documentation or searching for certain things within the health system. Roughly half of a physician's day is documenting patient information versus, delivering care or working on, more improvements around delivering care. Leads to burnout, not only at the physician level, but also other clinical professionals within the organization. So incorporating things like a voice-activated documentation, like Amazon Transcribe Medical, was something that they leveraged to really reduce that documentation burden. It reduces the ability for, misrepresentation of what was done in the visit room as well. So obviously patient consent is a key component to that, but virtual scribing is probably something that a lot of organizations are starting to look at to reduce that amount of time that the physician spends just documenting things and making it, much more crisp and clean. So in summary, I think ultimately technology is not going to replace the decision making that's needed by the clinician. It's going to make it easier and more efficient to improve outcomes. Obviously, to achieve all this, you're going to need a highly redundant, scalable, resilient, high-performing solution. There's many out there. Software providers need to also architect and build their operation platform to run on, a true cloud-based service where you don't have interruptions, where you've got, from a maintenance perspective, no downtimes, no security breaches, because those can be extremely expensive as well to deal with. From a partnership, Infor obviously has been with Amazon Web Services for, roughly a decade, leveraging our healthcare operation platform out there for several years. Visibility into the EMR as well as the, back office applications. So improvements, need to occur, but you need to really be in the cloud to get those to start, because the amount of scale, the amount of churning of, terabytes, if not petabytes of data are very hard to replicate and reproduce in each individual health system across the United States. I think to close, ultimately, there are cost reductions when it comes to infrastructure, servers, storage, things of that nature. Staff productivity, we want to focus on providing care, not documenting and searching for information or assets throughout the health system. So leveraging AI, RTLS, RFID, those things obviously are the next phase that we see for organizations. And then having an environment that's always available so that you can have predictive analytics that are available 24/7, real time, having that stability to be able to provide that extremely important as well. I'm going to hand this back over to Chuck to kind of wrap up and go through a Q&A session.
Cool. Thank you very much, Todd. So call to action, a few things that I would challenge everybody on the phone to do. First off, ask yourself, what timely questions do I want to ask that I currently cannot get answers to? So concepts like, man, I would really like to have mid-month labor productivity variance reporting. Or, man, I would really love to be able to benchmark my 3 different hospital locations against each other in an array of different areas. Very good, very smart questions to ask, but they're possibly harder to do right now. So what are some of those questions you'd like to ask? Second off, what new integrations that you don't have today, or what deeper integrations than you have today, would add value and why? So questions like, if I mix and match my clinical data with my financial data, what correlations can I look for? Can I start to see where the value of reducing cost starts to actually impact the care so that I should stop doing it from that point forward? Obviously, that's more of a downstream question that I don't think as an industry we're about ready to ask yet, but those are the types of things that I'm starting to think about. Eventually we're going to get to a point where we have a trolley car problem, where we're going to have realized we have cut so much cost out that we can't do anymore without actually negatively impacting care. And don't get me wrong, I think we're a long way away from that, but it's just, we need to at least start moving in that direction, even though that problem is out there if it is 15 or 20 years out. Can I start to design? And I always challenge everyone to do this. First off, design with the end in mind. Think about what kind of analytics and what are the benefits you're looking for so that I can figure out how we can get there. And the biggest thing I say that anybody can do now, even in your legacy ERP, if you haven't moved to this kind of next generation of ERP that's out there, is to normalize now. If you've got 7 different health systems, 7 different hospitals, and they're all on different charts of accounts, or they're all different item masters, or they all have different department structures on the HR side of the fence. Most of those things are things that you can start normalizing today, whether or not you actually do that in your existing system, or at least where you start to lay out what it'll look like in the new system. You should certainly be able to start at least figuring out where the opportunities are to normalize, and at least start planning for that. And then the fourth one, and this one, it really goes understated, and I can't say it enough after being through my years as a management consultant. How do you mitigate risk within your particular organization's culture? And everyone's going to be a little bit different, especially if you look at very different, very diversified organizations. Maybe you've got some inner city hospitals and you've got some rural hospitals. Those are going to have different cultures within them. How do you look at the individual cultures and figure out, okay, if we're going to do a transformative redesign of our applications, how's that going to impact people? When I was at the last Becker's conference, a great example, I believe it was one of the Common Spirit CFOs said about they didn't take into account when merging a for-profit hospital and a non-for-profit hospital that the for-profit hospital was burning like $40 an hour on people making phone calls to get a $50 payment. And they really had to figure out, we have to merge, we have to figure out how to get those cultures to combine if we actually do want to merge the operations of those 2 hospitals together. So it's from that all the way to what's the impact going to be on my org charts? If we have all this data in one centralized place, does our decision support crew within our finance org chart really need to be separate from our financial planning and analytics crew, or should they be the same people? So again, lots of cultural questions that we can ask there. I would say once you start to do that, really start to think about what are the qualitative and quantitative value points to your organization by looking at them. Help yourself help you. There's a great book called The Challenger Sale, which a lot of salespeople read, but I love there was an entire chapter on it on how it's applicable to non-salespeople. You may have a great idea within your organization and you want to enact it, but if you think about it, you have to sell it up. Even though you're not selling outside of your organization, you still have to sell your manager and their manager and eventually the CFO, the CEO, the CIO, whoever it may be, on why that is a good thing. So, start thinking about what the qualitative and quantitative value could be by doing these types of things, and then you can start to back into some numbers via models. And in the meantime, I would also say challenge all of your software vendors. I don't care if it's us. I don't care who it is. Challenge them all as to how they address all of the above. Challenge them to figure out how can you help me connect with my patients more directly, not just via data, again, but via functionalities. How can you help me connect disparate data sources together so I can ask better questions and get more timely responses so I can make better decisions? These are all things that you should be challenging everybody you have, and I would say it's never too early to start doing it. I talk to clients who just signed into a 5-year contract with vendor X, and they are thinking, oh, I don't have to worry about that for 4.5 years. But when you think about it, no matter what that vendor is doing, you really need to consider it 2.5 years from today, because you don't want to find yourself behind the ball where you're stuck signing another 5-year contract and now you're locked in for that much further, when if you had done some preparation work, you could have figured out what's a better way to do this functionality. Maybe it is with that vendor. I'm certainly not saying that it isn't, but you at least need to take that into account so you're making an educated decision and you're not backed against the wall when it is time to make that decision. So with that, we'll push it over to a short Q&A.
Thank you so much, Chuck and Todd, for that fantastic presentation. And we will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. We've had some great audience participation throughout and some great questions here. We'll get started with this one. So where do you see the line between EHR and ERP?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you think about it, we're really blurring it, especially as we get clinically focused functionality or things that directly drive nurse behavior, things that directly drive physician behavior. That line really is blurring. What I will say is this, and this is, if I didn't work for anybody, I would say this. I would say, I just can't believe that an EHR hasn't bought an ERP yet. I frankly can't believe that they're so separated right now. The EHRs, while they're open to some flavors of partnerships, it's very different. Like Epic, for example, they don't really have a formal partnership where, hey, pass us data back and forth. They have more of an open model. I think Cerner's a little bit more open to it. But I think in general, as for where that line is, most of it's going to be, okay, what does the ERP do? Because that's your day-to-day operational tool. That's where you're in and everybody's in there doing the majority of the work. Sometimes you just can't get away from the blurred lines, and it's going to be, hey, we need our GL data so we can run indirect allocations to figure out costs. Okay, well, that's clearly going to be on the non-EHR side of the house. But I think it's a good question. So again, where do you see the line between the EHR, ERP? I think it's just a good question that you really need to think as an organization where you want that functionality to come from. And again, challenge the vendor, whether it's your EHR or your ERP or whoever else it is. If it's not your ERP, challenge them to figure out, can you do this and what's the best way to do it?
Great. Thanks for shedding some light on that, Chuck. And so the next question we have here, the attendee asks, so what should we do if we have multiple EHRs due to M&A?
Yeah, that's always an interesting one. I mean, obviously, if you're doing M&A, you're going to have some level of, okay, I need to do integrations now. I know from talking with clients, though, it's not necessarily realistic, even if you have a model to bridge everybody together from an implementation migration plan from a system point of view. It's not necessarily realistic to do everybody at once. I know I've talked with different organizations who are in active M&A activities where they may have X billion dollars in bonds and they want to purchase 10 hospitals and then merge them together. I saw the same concept over in manufacturing as well. So yeah, obviously the ideal thing to do is to bring all of your EHRs into one. Now, again, though, that kind of does assume that you're a hold organization. If you think about it, healthcare orgs of today they're effectively diversified private equity groups. So you may own physicians groups, or they may actually be employed by you. You may own facilities. You may own clinics. You may own an insurance plan. You may own long-term care facilities. These are all very different lines of business potentially. I've even had some clients. We had one client that owned a power plant. We had another healthcare client who owned a supermarket. So you never know what you're going to end up with. And I would say, yes, the ideal thing is to bridge them all together, but you do have to take into account, okay, are we potentially going to divest in anything, first off? So are we a house flipper, so to speak, for organizations? So you got to take that into account. But the ideal thing to do, if you need to wait for whatever reason, is, again, figure out what you want to be able to do. If I look at it and I say, why would I own two separate hospitals? Well, I'm going to, in so many words, I'm going to pit them against each other. I want to see what's working well in this hospital and how can I apply it to the other one, and vice versa. If you haven't normalized the data at some level, you can't do that. So at minimum, you need to have some flavor of like an enterprise data warehouse in the middle with mapping between them. Maybe you use one hospital's, or you probably want to use the corporate data structures. Normalize everything into that, and that allows you to benchmark those two hospitals against each other to really get the economies of scale that you're looking for. So I would say, again, it depends on where you're at in an organization and where you're at in your life cycle of your M&A. But overall, ideally, you just merge. Second thing would be to at least normalize.
Some great tactical insights there. And so the next question we'll take here is, how do you recommend overcoming the disparate political ownership of the 3P systems we'd be replacing?
Yeah, that's funny. The political ownership, that's a tough one, because the political ownership can be the hardest things. I've seen it where, for lack of a better term, people feel like people are going after their jobs because you're taking away this piece of software that they use, and they can turn it into like a cultural cancer almost, so to speak, where they're like, no, we're not going to let you take away all these things that I want to do. The biggest way that I would say is you really need to take your time. You really need to think about what are everyone's roles in the new world. One simple example is that of, like, let's say an IT person who builds reports, a report writer. Yes, as of today, in your legacy ERP, they may be writing COBOL code or SQL. They're doing, whether it be Crystal or a handful of other report presentation tools. In the new world, where most of these ERPs, whether it's ours or elsewhere, they offer you much more data access capabilities. That means that you don't need as many reports. And I'm not saying now that FTE should go away over in IT, but what I would say is there's higher value activities that they can certainly do. So Todd brought up machine learning and all that data connectivity. Well, should they be looking at how do we connect the data together in a more usable fashion? Should they look at how do we make invoices go through the system more easily? And how should we look for outliers better to reduce risk and concepts like that? So while it is certainly a sticky subject, I do agree. Org charts are they can change certainly, especially if you think about it. I know in my experience, a lot of finance org charts in particular were effectively built based on what they were effectively built based on what a particular piece of software could do. So it was, we bought this tool to do budgeting and planning, and this other tool to do costing. Therefore, we have a separate FP&A group and a decision support group. That really changes that outlook of how all of the org charts should come together. So it's something you just need to ponder.
Great. Thanks for tackling those questions, Chuck. And we're approaching the end of the hour here, so I want to see if you or Todd have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our attendees today.
Yeah, first I'll note, I see there are a couple other questions. I apologize we couldn't get to them. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to talk with anybody about any questions you have. I think from my point of view, I tried as much as I could to make this not at all salesy and not really talk about the organization that I work for. If I can maybe just spend 30 seconds real quick and say, this is the strategic direction of what we're trying to do. So, connect the business of healthcare with the mission of healthcare here at Infor. That's what we're going for. Our clients tell us that we do have the closest realization of this vision, and I will flat out admit some of the things I talked about today we may not necessarily do yet, but these are all on our strategic outlook. I would say, regardless, this is what you should be asking everybody to do. So I don't care if you're looking at a competitor. These are the things, if I worked in your shoes, if I worked for a healthcare provider, these are the things I would want to do, and that's why I'm pushing our organization in for to specifically do it. And that goes in the same with the clinically connected capabilities, and why I really drill into it. It's not just about the integrations, it's about the functionality you get thanks to those data integrations. These are all things that we specifically have capabilities that can directly help you do. Most of these have very quantifiable value that we can help you build. So again, whether you use us, whether you use a third-party solution, whether you choose not to go with us at all, I definitely challenge everyone to do this, because at the end of the day, we all are going to have loved ones who have to get care at some organization at some point, and we're not going to sit there and say, well, gee, which ERP, quote unquote, do they use? So I like to think that by having conversations like this, I'm driving everybody to think about what is the best path forward for the whole industry and the whole country.
Thank you
Todd,
so much, Chuck.
add?
And that is all the time. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking Todd if he had anything.
No, I think you summarized it well. I think there's a transformation that's occurring. Where we're going to get those outcomes that we want is going to be leveraging science. And, you know, that really is the movement here for the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for your excellent presentation, and I'd also like to thank Infor for sponsoring today's webinar. That is all the time we have for today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.